Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Ruth Zearfoss. I'm the editor-in-chief of Cell Reports Methods at Cell Press. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm very excited. I think we have some exciting things to share with you. This webinar is made possible as part of the Cell Press 50th anniversary. One of the goals of the anniversary is to provide the community with resources that will help sustain the health of the community, not just currently for the current year, but for the next 50 years going forward. And I have a huge thank you to issue to Yadira, Soto-Feliciano, and Iain Cheeseman from MIT. I'll let them introduce themselves in a minute. They have a wealth of experience and knowledge navigating the peer review process, both as authors and reviewers, and I'm so grateful that they're willing to come and share some of that with everyone today. Would you like to take a minute and introduce yourselves?
Hi, my name is Iain Cheeseman. I'm a faculty member at Whitehead Institute and MIT. And it's great to be here because I really have always valued peer review as an author. It's really made each of our papers better, and having a constructive and deliberate process is wonderful. And I also really enjoy peer review as a reviewer and thinking about how I contribute constructively to the science that other people are doing as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yadira Soto-Feliciano. I'm an intramural faculty member at the Koch Institute at MIT and also MIT Biology. And similar to Iain and Ruthie, I'm very passionate about the topic of peer reviewing because it's not only important for making our science better, but also it's really important to teach the next generation of scientists how the process occurs and how to do it properly. So thank you all for joining us today.
I also wanted to take a minute and mention that this webinar was initiated by Brian Plosky as one of his projects as he was the editor-in-chief of Molecular Cell. So a huge thank you to him as well, and also for providing some of the resources that we're presenting, and also Matt Pavlovich, who also provided some resources. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the webinar, I wanted to just sort of set the expectations and let you know what we're going to be presenting. So there are basically two parts to this webinar. And the first part is an overview of the peer review process itself, a discussion around what's appropriate to include in a review that you're providing to your colleagues in a peer review context, and also a discussion of any other important considerations when preparing a review, such as ethical considerations. The second part, we're going to dig in a little bit more deeply into the nuts and bolts of what exactly is in a peer review, what goes in what section. We'll look at some examples from published peer reviews. You'll have an opportunity to weigh in on what you think is useful or not useful in some of those examples. And then we'll also have a little bit of time at the end for a question and answer session where hopefully if you have any questions left, we'll be able to help you answer those. So I thought it would be useful to give you an overview of the peer review process. And peer review is really a very collaborative process. The editors are the mediators of the process. Peer review itself is I would say, the central component in the peer review process. It's the name that's circled in red here. So authors submit the papers to editors. Editors will send the papers to peer review and be an impartial mediator of that. They will then, if a paper is invited for revision, return it back to the authors, and the paper will come back through with the peer reviewers weighing in on the content of the paper, whether it is suitable or not. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about this, whether it's suitable for publication or not, ultimately, hopefully leading to the successful publication of a manuscript. So I wanted to take a minute and just talk about why peer review is so important. I've worked for a journal for almost 10 years now, and I've really seen, I think, the value that peer review provides to the community. I think it's really important to share this because it may not always be apparent from an author's point of view. So I think peer review really provides a service to authors at its core. It's a place where scientists are able to get substantive and constructive feedback from their community, their specific community, that will help them improve their work. And a lot of times people may not want to give you this feedback face-to-face. It's a safe place for this to happen. It also helps ensure that the conclusions in a paper are well supported by the data. That's another critical component of peer review. Helps uphold the quality of the scientific literature. Another side benefit is that if you're looking at papers that are not in your field, if you understand the standards of a particular collection of papers, such as they're in a journal, you have an expectation about the quality level of the papers that are present in that collection. You might have an expectation of whether they might be trustworthy or not. Hopefully they're trustworthy. And the community itself has a reliable source of information to work from.
And Ruthie, just to add to that, I think I was saying at the beginning how much I really value peer review, and thinking about all the ways that it's improved our science to have someone who really takes the time to comment on our work and how to make it better, whether that be sort of the clarity of our communication and how we can, set things up better, a key missing control that we had, maybe a different model for where our science was. It's always made constructive contributions to the science that we're doing. I really value that. I really can't imagine science without that. And so all of us have that, important role and obligation to really make science as best as we can. And just seeing the value of peer review across both our work and others has always really struck me.
And can I add a point about the sort of aspect of getting feedback from not face-to-face that you mentioned that I think is really important, in particular for junior scientists who, are still learning how the process is. And also, the idea that I feel intimidated giving this direct feedback to somebody who's already an established figure in the field. And I think having this process in place that allows us to provide feedback or also receive feedback in a way that, we feel safe, I think it's absolutely and particularly important.
Yeah, and I did also, so those are, I think, really important benefits of peer review, but I think it's not without stating some of the drawbacks. I don't think they're drawbacks, but they are, I guess, more challenging aspects. So peer review does take time. There's a period of time where everyone's nervous, everyone's waiting to see what the comments are. It's an unfortunate part of the process. As editors, we work to keep this going as fast as we can, but it's a reality. And also, I think receiving criticisms of one's work is hard. I think people invest a lot of time and effort into creating something that they've worked really hard laboring on. And to see, to take the criticism constructively and in the spirit that it's intended, it's not always easy. But I think learning to do that is really important and can only help benefit your own science in the long run. It's easier for me to say as an editor. I'm sure Iain and Yadira might have more practical suggestions about how to do that. But so I just, as a counterpoint, I wanted to just mention the possibility of a world without peer review, what that might look like. Many papers would be available without any sort of an indication to, I would say, the lay reader as to the quality of the paper. I think probably everyone feels a certain level of comfort looking at papers in their own field, but looking at papers outside of your own field, I think they're very difficult to judge the quality or impact of those papers. And I think the community as a whole is more and more interested in science and wants to engage more with the literature. So I think it becomes even more important. So according to a 2023 article that I found online, looking at preprints, in particular, only 7.3% of preprints had any sort of a comment on them, which is unfortunate because it means over 90% of the papers are not going to have any indication of community feedback on those papers, unless it was given personally to the author. And as I already mentioned, scientists may have difficulties evaluating papers outside their field. So I think those are some of the drawbacks, but there are some advantages. I think it's putting your paper out there without any peer reviews faster, and it's also, I think it may feel better psychologically as well. So don't know if Iain or Yadira, you have anything to add there? No. Okay, I'll go on. So what is the role of a reviewer? Okay, the essential core role is to assess the quality of a manuscript. I can kind of break this down into a few different points. Do the findings support the conclusions that the authors are drawing? I'd say this is like the essential, most essential point. Are the experimental approaches appropriate for the question? Are the experiments conducted carefully? Is the data reliable? And is all of the information that's required to repeat the experiments presented? I think this is, from the publishing side, this is a really important part of peer review. It can be difficult to enforce, but that is the goal, is that all of the information would be available so that the experiments could be repeated just as they were done in the paper. We have a general timeline for completion for 10 days. And I think it's also worth just mentioning philosophically what the goal of peer review is, because I think sometimes people may not understand this. The goal is not to sort of tear down a piece of work. The goal is to offer constructive criticism of the work and indicate a level of interest in the work to help the authors find a venue for publication for their manuscript. That's the overall goal. There may be cases where there may be some fundamental problems with the paper that it needs to be rethought from a fairly basic level. And if that's the case, that really does need to be explained very diplomatically. So there are other topics that are also within the scope of a review. These are a little bit more case specific. But as a journal editor, we do look to reviewers to give us an indication of whether they think the scope of the advance is appropriate for the particular journal. And as an editor, I don't always know the latest information about what's going on in every field and what's going to be exciting to different groups of people. And we do look to reviewers for that kind of information. Are there any ethical concerns about the work that's done in the paper? There are certain fields where things are progressing rapidly, and we need to know the latest to make sure we're up to date on those. And are there any other field-specific responsibilities or field-specific considerations? And something like this might be if there's a clinical trial, there can be specific requirements for that type of publication. So we need to have all the details about that as well. And reviewers really are helpful if they can ensure that all that's being done correctly.
And Ruth, one thing I would say, you've done a great job of highlighting the many parts of what a review can do, from either the big picture to, specific experiments and also these ethical concerns. I think that peer review is so valuable, but it's also important to recognize that it's inherently can be imperfect. And so, me as a reviewer, I really aspire to do my best to identify all those things. But it is also important to recognize that, we don't have 4 years to be able to review a paper or repeat some of the work. And so I think thinking about it as a way to constructively add as much as possible to that process, but that, after a paper is published or after it receives other comments, there's still ways that it can continue to be improved or discussed within the field as well.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And I think, Iain, I used your words verbatim on here. Everyone in science has a collective responsibility to advance rigorous, reproducible, and high-quality science and discoveries. And I think that is sort of the mindset that it's very useful if a reviewer has that mindset going into the process. Yeah. So I also wanted to mention the benefits of being a peer reviewer, because it does take time. It takes a lot of time, and it's an investment on the part of the peer reviewer to engage in this. So some of the benefits are that peer review works when there's engagement from the reviewers and from the authors, and sincere engagement. So peer review works when everyone buys into the system. You're contributing something to your colleagues who work in your field, and if they have a good experience, they're more likely to contribute as a peer reviewer when you submit your paper down the line. Being a peer reviewer means you get to see cutting edge, unpublished research in your own field, which it's exciting. seeing the latest and greatest before other people get to see it. I think from my point of view,
I think this is obviously one that's maybe a little bit more on the reviewer side than the journal side, and maybe Yadira and I can talk a little bit this while you're working on your audio settings. And I think this slide very nicely highlights some of these key things, which is I think maybe it's easier to frame the advantages to an author of why feedback is valuable, why we need to be, and for maybe the community, why we need to be rigorous consumers of that literature to ensure that only high quality work is presented. But I've really valued being a reviewer in much of the way that Ruthie highlights on this slide, where I think that it really helped shape the quality of the work in my lab and the way that we think about presenting our own papers, to see what that review process looks like, and to be able to contribute myself was a really great way to think about how our own work would be evaluated. Seeing the other reviewers and what their comments were is always interesting. Seeing the way that a journal deals with a paper, and I think that when I started, I'm always going to seek out those opportunities to serve as a peer reviewer, and so I think it's a particularly valuable part of the science to be on both sides. And I think it's also just a really fun thing to be able to see and engage in other people's work. It's like all of our colleagues around here. I love seeing what other people are doing and living vicariously through that science. And so I think it really is a joy and a privilege to be a reviewer in a way that benefits us too.
Yeah, and I just want to add that to me, it's also a very effective way to develop that scientific writing kind of skills, because it is a form of scientific writing, right? Being able to provide written feedback to other people's work, I think it's something that I value a lot. And now with my own lab members, I think it's a process that is really has been helpful for them to see from the inside in, and I think they also feel the same way, that their scientific writing has evolved in very positive ways through these peer review exercises.
Yeah, exactly as Yadira said, I really view this as a piece of scholarship, and we work on that with the papers that we write. But a peer review is a piece of scholarship that we should all be really proud of and value very highly. Ruthie, I still think you're not back. Maybe let's see if I can adjust it. If we go to sort of the next slide and continue to go while you're playing there, and maybe even logging in and logging back out may solve that for resetting. And so I'm going to keep going if that's all right, Ruthie, and continue this great presentation that you arise. And so what Ruthie has next on these slides is actually just really thinking about what your role is when you're asked to review a paper. And so when you're brought in, and this tends to be quite similar between journals and particularly across the cell press journals in which I've served as a reviewer, and that no matter where you're going to want to have a similar framework to your review. And so an editor is going to ask you to provide that review, but it's something where they're not going to be an expert in every single field, and having your take home on really what does the paper say beyond what the authors wrote in their abstract or what they write. How do you as a reviewer see what the nature of that paper is? What are its main points? What conceptual advances is it making? And then beyond that to start to be able to sort of provide your opinion on how the nature of those experiments, particularly do they support the conclusions and the suitability of the approaches they use, the nature of the advance. And so it's very helpful to start with one main paragraph to provide that summary, and maybe finish that paragraph with a clear sentence that defines what your recommendation is for that paper. Do you support its publication? Are there major challenges that need to be addressed in some way? And so what Ruthie has on this slide is really nicely providing a framework for what this looks like, defining that key question. Are the approaches and conclusions appropriate? Are they supported by the data? And then as well as your overall take home. So definitely, this is your opportunity really to frame that in your own light at the beginning, one starting paragraph that explains where things are. And do we have your sound back, Ruthie?
Testing.
Yeah, excellent. Okay.
Excellent. Okay. I had to log out and log back in. Okay. Thank you for taking this slide while I was trying to fix that.
I think you can move to the next one now.
Okay, great. Okay, so after the first paragraph comes what I would call kind of the nuts and bolts of the peer review. Did I skip a page or no? Okay, great. Okay, so in this section, it should be very point by point. So you should go through the paper in detailed fashion, figure by figure, laying out the contents of each figure, what is strong and what is perhaps could be improved within each figure. So this is your chance to give detailed information about the conclusions that are drawn from this particular panel aren't supported, and here's why. A different approach should be used instead of the one taken here. This type of very concrete information should be provided in this middle section of the peer review, the main points. And the final section, we don't always see this in a peer review, but it can be helpful, is what I would call the minor points. So from an editor's perspective of this, these are the points that are more presentation related, not necessarily the fundamental core conclusions of the paper, but smaller conclusions, different turns of phrase that may be used, color of different figures, labeling of figures, this type of issue. It's always nice to have all of that as polished as possible, but that's not going to make or break a paper. And so those should be presented in the minor points section. Okay. And then, sorry. Okay. And so then there are a few just considerations I just wanted to mention that should trend throughout all of these different sections. So it's really important that the overall tone and recommendation is consistent from section to section to section. So if you make a very positive statement about a paper in the main summary, and then go on to point out what look like really fundamental criticisms in the main points, can be a little bit confusing from an author's point of view to what your actual opinion is about the paper. And I would say that this is something that's just really very important to be aware of. And also, it's very important to remember that this is somebody's work, a human's work, and to treat the authors as you would like them to treat you when you're on the other side of the equation. So present everything as diplomatically as you can and refer to the figure and refrain from any unproductive comments, I would say.
And Ruthie, just to say that of all of the things that we'll say today, these are perhaps the most important, right? Is that, we have a large obligation. We want to certainly improve science in a way that is not personal and really is constructive. And I think Yadira and I both take that really seriously for everything that we do. I think substantive comments are really helpful too. When I get feedback on a paper, it's not, someone liked it, someone didn't like it. That's fine. It's good to know. But really, the more substantive someone can be, this is an experiment that would add a lot in this way, or I don't think you can make this conclusion without having this other statement, or it's not that I thought you had spelling errors, but like here's a place in which the communication could be tangibly improved to increase the access for the paper. The more substantive, clear, and constructive that you can be, the better. And recognizing no matter who you think you're writing a review to, it's actually the first author of the paper, and it's a product that they've been working on for 1 to 5 years, and you need to make sure that you are respectful to everybody throughout.
Yeah, I just want to double down on that point. This is a process that involves humans and humans in both sides. So I think it's really important to keep that, in front of you when you're in either side of the equation.
Okay, I'm going to move on. So thank you to Brian Plosky for this video. So this is just an example of what you're going to see when you submit a peer review. So this is taken from the Molecular Cell website. This is what molecular cell reviewers see when they submit a review. So as you can see, there's a window at the top for the overall recommendation, and then there's some instructions to reviewers. I'm just going to play this video. It's just going to show you briefly the windows where you'll fill in your text, and then some questions that you will be asked to answer. I hope it's running. Is this running from it? If it doesn't run, then. Okay, I'll go on because I don't see this running on my end.
No, I do see it running. It's nice, and
okay.
because that framework of a review is very helpful. But actually seeing what the back end at the journal looks like, I think was really fascinating for me the first time I saw this, and seeing all the other information that's asked along the way is quite useful.
Okay, great. So once this is stopped, I'll advance.
And it stopped.
Okay. So you'll notice that there were some fields for the editor that were on this screen. And so I just wanted to take a moment to talk about what should go in that field for the editor comment. I think one thing that's really important is that the tone of those comments to the editor, like we were talking about before, does need to match the tone of the comments to the author. I think it can be tempting to just sort of put something very casual up in that box to the editor. And I would say just, think carefully about how you want to use that. It is in general the most transparent and also in the author's best interest to provide all of the comments that you have to make on a paper to the author. That way everything is clear. The author can very deeply understand the basis for the editor's decision when that happens. It's less confusing to the author. But there might be times when you need to use that box. And so what should you use it for? It's very convenient to put a lay summary of your opinion up in that box. It can be, as you'll see in some of our examples that we're going to go through later, it can be difficult to sort through a lot of technical detail in order to distill the essential components. That's a nice place to do that. There might be some information you need to provide that would expose your identity as a reviewer, and you might not be comfortable doing that. And if that's the case, you can use it for that. And there might be a time when there was an ethical point that you would like to raise with the editor, something that might need to be resolved. And so it's also a nice confidential place for you to do that. And Iain and Yadira, I don't know if you have any other use cases for that box that you would want to mention. No.
I try to be very transparent about when there is a limitation to the knowledge that I have. Often you're asked to review something where you've got specific expertise, but there's other features of a paper that you may not know. And so I often will share that in the private comments in a way that may be more specific to my own identity. When there's something else that I feel like is just important for providing context for where my comments are coming from, I'll use that. But I would say I actually rarely use that box, so maybe 2% of the time. And generally my feeling is that any comment I have should be transparent and clear to both the editor and the reviewers. And
Yeah. Similarly, I rarely use this subsection. In another, I will say, instance in which I've written something along the lines of potentially sort of parallel work that is kind of similar to the one presented in these, not from my lab, but that I've seen at a conference or have seen a preprint on a similar topic, is something that I try to make the editor aware of sort of in this particular section, but very rarely use similarly.
So I just wanted to also mention any ethical considerations that might come up during a review. And I think the first and most important is just be aware of any potential conflicts of interest. As editors, we try to be aware of potential conflicts of interest that we can find, but we will not always know all of them. So examples of some of these would be ongoing collaborations, as particularly new ones, if you haven't collaborated with somebody in the past, but you're actively working on a related topic right now. Scientific disagreements, these can be conflicts of interest. And any close personal relationship that you might have with someone would also be a potential conflict of interest. That extends to like former mentors. So it's also very important to maintain confidentiality at all times. So do not share any information about the paper without obtaining approval from an editor. Given potential conflicts of interest, they can be everywhere, and you wouldn't want to undermine an author's work accidentally by revealing any information about it. In the review, you want to always maintain a polite and constructive, but also honest tone. And I'd say that's the most important thing. And always refrain from making any personal comments, and always keep them focused on the data and the manuscript, because that's what you're reviewing. Treat your community the way you want to be treated. So be timely. We're all people. We all have unexpected things happen. People get sick. People have unexpected life events, and these do happen, and they can delay things. And if they happen, communicate with the editor, share the information. We all understand these things happen, and transparency is usually the best way to proceed with all of this. And also be available to provide feedback on the revised manuscript. It's really useful. You've already looked at the paper one time. You know what your concerns were. It would be a faster process for you to look through and see if your concerns were addressed than for somebody have to engage fresh with the manuscript and understand your perspective at the same time. That can extend the process for the authors. So it's important to be available to review a revised paper. And lastly, and this is a new concern, relatively new concern, we now have generative AI, and it's available to everyone. And we do not allow a generative AI to be used in the preparing or review of a manuscript. There are a few different reasons for this. The first is that if you use it, you don't know if that confidential information will then be used to train something in the future. It may no longer be confidential. It's unknown what's going to happen with that. And also, generative AI is not, there's no entity who can stand behind it and be responsible for it. There can be errors in it that could be propagated. So we don't allow generative AI to be used in the review process. So Iain and Yadira, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on any of the ethical issues around review.
I think one of the things that we've often discussed to Ruthie in conversations with you is that if in doubt, let the editor know. And I think that there is often, for many of us, there's clear black and white components of just what shouldn't be appropriate. And of course, you should never be reviewing, a paper from your best friend or longtime continuing collaborator or something like that. But there's a lot of things that maybe are ambiguous, and I think that it's quite useful to, if in doubt, to let the editor know or ask a question. And I think that it can be a very constructive way to engage in these. And so certainly aspiring to be positive and constructive throughout. And if you need support in that, ask somebody.
Yeah, I just want to add a point about the last bullet point, because this is a fairly nascent and new challenge that we are all encountering. And I think it's really important to highlight the confidentiality aspect of it, as you mentioned, Ruthie, that as you put it in one of these models that are publicly available, there might be a place where that confidentiality point it's broken, and people have to be aware of. But yeah, we'll learn more as time passes. Well, yeah,
we will. Okay, so I want to move into the next part of the webinar now, which is the example section. And so what I've done here in this section is I've taken examples from published peer reviews, and I just want to say before we get started that these published peer reviews are all fabulous. So I'll just kind of let the cat out of the bag right there. They're really great examples of high quality peer reviews. So there's I think they're useful as a way to discuss some of the positives. And also there may be places where they could be improved a little bit. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to read these. although they're small on my screen, so apologies for any errors. And then we're going to have some polls, and you can answer some questions about these reviews and see what you found useful in them and what you thought perhaps could be improved in them. So the other point I would like to make is that these are very technical. So these are published peer reviews taken from Cell Systems. They publish peer reviews periodically. And so they tend to be very mathematical, and so people outside of these fields might not, like myself, might not necessarily understand all of the technical details. But I think that there are important parts of these that will allow you to understand what the reviewer is getting at, even if the technical details are not. Can we go back? I'm just seeing the poll right now and not the review. I'll set to it. Okay, I can see it now. Okay, so I'm going to read this just so that it's really clear for everyone. So this would be in the overview section. It says overview. So this is that main part of the review. So this manuscript investigates why computational methods to learn transcriptional regulatory networks from gene expression data are generally recognized to be inaccurate despite decades of methodological research on the problem. Even though the underlying issues, the abundance of false positives and invalidity of the causal sufficiency assumption, are known in the TRN inference community, this work puts a fresh take on them through the Model X knockoff formalism. Overall, the computational analyses are rigorous and very well documented in the supplementary GitHub repositories. One of the main limitations of the manuscript in its present form is in the presentation. The manuscript is written with the assumption that the reader is familiar with the Model X knockoff framework, which is not introduced until the supplement. Okay, so hopefully you should have all had a poll jump out. I've closed my poll. Can someone else read the poll? Oh, wait. Oh, no, I found it. Okay. So what are the strengths of this comment from the reviewer? You can answer the ones that you find appropriate. You can check more than one. So is the opinion of the reviewer coming through clearly in this overview statement? Does this overview statement contain unnecessary technical details? Is that a strength, or would that be a weakness? Is the advance that the authors are presenting clearly apparent in this overview in the context of the literature that came before it? And does the comment clearly present strengths and weaknesses of the paper? And this is a lot to ask of a small paragraph on a very technical paper. I'm going to give everyone a few seconds to answer. Okay, so I think we've had, they're coming in. Okay, so it looks like the top results are that the opinion clearly comes through, and I agree with this. And the strengths and weaknesses are clearly presented. Yeah, and I agree with this. I think the reviewer did a really good job of laying those out. So I think we can talk a little bit about whether the advance is clearly presented in the context of the literature. I can take this, or I don't know if Iain or Yadira, if you want to take it. So there's a phrase in here, even without getting into the, I guess, the nitty gritty of the models. This work takes a fresh take on the underlying issues, even though those underlying issues have been appreciated for decades. And I think, to me, that little bit is really important. As we all work in the context of, I say we, I don't, but I read papers that do, in the context of all the work that came before. And I think this I can see that this might be a point of discussion about this paper. I don't know that that's the case, but just from this comment, I can imagine it might be. And I think this reviewer's done a really nice job of kind of highlighting why, even though people have worked on this for a long time, that it's a fresh take, that it's interesting and important.
One thing to comment on, and particularly looking at the Q&A as questions have coming in too, I think that you thinking about this first paragraph, I think that there's a substance that you ought to have regardless of what journal you're reviewing for. Do the data match the conclusions and many of the other points that we've already discussed? And then some of it is how much of an advance it is. Is it suitable for this journal? And though ultimately that is an important thing for the editor to be able to navigate and decide based on that reviewer feedback, providing some information and context for that. And so I think, Ruthie, you really nicely highlighted here that statement makes an effort to try to contextualize it. Yes, it's in the context of prior work and there's an advance, but this reviewer sees this as valuable and really informative. And so I think that can be quite helpful for the editor as they try to navigate appropriate decisions for that journal.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that, and I think it's nice that the reviewer also put it in kind of plain words that is very easy to understand. Okay, they're recognizing the advancement, contextualize advancement, I should say. But
okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So this is from the same review, required major revisions. Okay, it is difficult to interpret the results in figure 3F that the global activities of Jasper mouse motifs in the ATAC matrix do not improve the false discovery rates. Okay, this approach for summarizing ATAC-seq data provides only a coarse summary quite different from the current methods. Current sentiment in the field is that combining these two data modalities is one of the most promising ways to overcome the severe limitations of TRN inference from RNA-seq data alone. Okay, so can switch to the poll. Hopefully everyone can see it, or it should be coming up soon if you can't. So what aspects of this comment do you find the most constructive? It is clear which figure the comment references. There's a clear path to revision for the author. The significance of the concern is laid out clearly by the reviewer, and the reviewer has left it up to the author whether to complete this revision. Okay, I'm going to wait some time so people can answer. Okay, they're coming in. Okay, so I think we can start talking about this. We may have more votes filtering in. So I found this to be a very constructive comment. It's very clearly laid out. It's a required major revision. It's clearly labeled that. It clearly states the concern behind some of the data in the figure. It clearly references the exact figure and panel that the author is, or that the reviewer is concerned about. And it provides a path for revision. So this is, to me, very practical. I didn't see much negative about this. Move on to the next one. Okay. Okay. So this is under minor revisions, suggestions, and conclusions. I questioned some of the overall conclusions in the conclusions section. False discovery rate control would indeed be nice to have for the TRN inference, but all of the results presented here in real data show that it is not achievable with the Model X inference framework. So in addition, the concluding sentence is methods controlling FDR and TNR inference must either explicitly check the assumptions of causal sufficiency or avoid it. Okay, and again, this is technical. So, based upon prior work in the field, it is reasonable to believe that the causal, sorry, is it reasonable to receive that the causal sufficiency assumption will never be met in real data? Should the recommendation be to firmly move away from TR and inference methods that make that assumption? Question mark. Okay, so hopefully your poll should be coming up soon. So what could have been done a little bit more constructively in this section? The language in the comment could more closely match the language in the section heading. The reviewer could have provided a clear recommendation for a revision for the author. The reviewer could have engaged more deeply with the manuscript, or the reviewer could have signaled their interest in the paper more effectively. I'm going to give everyone about 10 seconds, I think, to answer. Okay, so I'll go ahead and talk about this. Hopefully people are through voting. So it looks like most people have voted for the reviewer could have provided a clear recommendation for a revision. I think that's true. The reviewer could have stated, please answer this question in the text or something. And that's not really clear. Because as an editor, looking at this, someone who's not deep in the field, deep in the technical details, questioning some of the overall conclusions, that might make me think this was a more major comment. And then to end on a question makes, it might leave a question mark in my head. And as an author, I can also see being confused by that. So I don't know if Iain and Yadira, if you would have a different spin on that.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was thinking. The sort of questioning overall conclusions as a minor comment, it's a little bit disconnected from my point of view.
Yeah. So, and what you would want as a reviewer, you would want to kind of put yourself in the author's shoes and say, okay, well, how would I respond to this as an author? Would I need to add a sentence, or do I need to do a whole bunch more work? It's not quite transparent or clear. Okay. I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking, okay, well, we can do this one and then maybe we'll skip the following one. But here's the last one. The results are, in my opinion, very exciting, and their extension to other signaling circuits could potentially reveal the ubiquity of pulsatile regulation in mammalian cells. I have no major concerns about this paper, although in my opinion, there are some confusing points in the presentation of the results that should be addressed prior to publication. Okay, so what are the strengths of this comment? The opinion of the reviewer is clear. The importance of the revisions that will be suggested are clear. Once you've answered that, there should be a pop-up question. So what would you think as the author if you were to continue reading the review and you came across the sentence, the data in figure 5 do not support the conclusions? What would you think the reviewer was trying to convey? Would you think that the reviewer supports the work once the conclusion is revised? Would you think that the figure should be removed from the paper? Would you think that the revision requested is major, or that this revision to figure 5 is minor? Everyone's had a little bit of time to answer this one. So going to the first part of this, I think, this is very, very clear comment and very, I love to see this type of comment. No major concerns about this paper, confusing points in the presentation, very clear. If something more specific that was added, perhaps the reviewer meant it as a minor concern. The data in Figure 5 do not support the conclusions. There's no statement indicating the significance of that to the overall manuscript, and how Figure 5 should be revised in response to that. How serious is that concern? It's very vague. And so that would then be more problematic for the author to respond to, because they don't understand the basis for that, and it does not match the results or the comments that were made up earlier in the peer review. And again, I just want to emphasize that this comment, the data in Figure 5, that's a hypothetical, representative of things that we do see, but it was not present in this particular case.
I think one thing, thinking about this as a work of scholarship and writing it too, we often, I think, sit down to write things, and you do that maybe in a stream of consciousness manner. And that's where you've written this and then you come across Figure 5 and you're like, well, but it doesn't really support the conclusions. I think that it's very helpful to write a review and then give a brief pause on it and then come back and read it and actually think about, how someone would read and interpret that, either the editor or the author. And so including a statement like that, it does need to be something that's clear and supported. And so, at least taking the time to think about what you've written and whether you can organize the review differently, or maybe after you've added these, you need to include something else in that first paragraph to highlight that this should be something that's changed. But spending a little bit of time just on the clarity can be helpful always.
I just want to add to the point that writing a review and then, having a few days in between and then coming back and rereading, because, sometimes we try to multitask, or sometimes we're in a mindset that doesn't sometimes see what it's in front of us, right? And I think it's important to revise our own scientific writing, and I think that's a good thing for the process overall.
Okay, so I'm gonna move on. I think we can skip this next one in the interest of time, because I see time is going very quickly. So I will move on to this next example, which is something that we do see from time to time, although this particular example I made up. And this is something that's paraphrased from confidential comments to the editor. I'm an expert in RNA sequencing, but have no expertise in the computational aspects of the study. I therefore enlisted the help of my collaborators, who are experts in computational biology, when completing the review. Has the reviewer acted appropriately? Once you've answered that, there should be another pop-up window. And if you thought no, how should the reviewer have acted when noticing that there was a gap in their expertise? So the reviewer was correct. They ensured that all technical areas were covered. The reviewer should have asked their colleague if they had a conflict of interest before asking them to participate. The reviewer should have reached out to the editor to confirm that it would be okay to engage their colleague in the review process, or it is never okay to enlist the help of a colleague in a peer review.
And Ruthie, in terms of maybe answering this question there too, and thinking about appropriate and not. So and maybe to jump to the head, and hopefully people have had a chance to fill in that poll. It's never okay to ask somebody else who has not been asked to review the paper to participate without explicit permission from the editor. The one exception to that, and we saw sort of in that movie at the beginning, is that you can indicate that somebody from your lab helped you review a paper. And so for myself, probably about 50% of the papers that I review, a grad student or the postdoc in the lab may contribute to. It's still a review that I'm writing, but we may discuss the paper and they may identify some points, but ultimately I will edit things to make sure that it's appropriate. That is certainly permissible, as my understanding from CellPress guidelines, although you indicate that person contributed to it. Anybody outside of your lab would never be okay without formal permission from the editor.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And as far as making sure, it is important to make sure technical areas are covered. We typically get different reviewers to cover different technical areas because we recognize that no one person will necessarily cover all technical areas. But we do appreciate reviewers that let us know if there's an area that they feel that they could not cover, so we can make sure that's covered elsewhere. Okay, and I do want to make sure we have time for the Q&A, and we're bumping up on 1 o'clock already. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump forward and show you in the handout section, we do have some resources for reviewers here. So there is a link to some online resources from Elsevier for reviewers. There is a place where you can manage peer review activities, a 30-day for reviewers, complimentary access to Scopus and Science Direct. There's also a place where you can volunteer to review. So if you're interested, take a look at this. And I think we can go ahead and jump to the Q&A. We don't have much more time. I think we can spend a few more minutes and take questions.
Ruthie, in terms of reading the Q&A as Yadira and I have throughout, one of the things that has come up several times that we haven't really answered outright, and actually I'm really curious for your take on too, is basically credit for and incentivizing peer review. And so many of the comments, talked about like how do you create a bandwidth and encourage people to participate in this process. I think there's of course sometimes suggestions for paying peer reviewers, which in my personal experience and opinion doesn't make a lot of sense. I want my papers reviewed. I don't want to add the cost to them, but I'm certainly willing to reciprocate to contribute to that. But the other ways of achieving reviewer credit, whether that be certificates or publons or things like that. Curious for things that CellPress does to help enable, recognize, or incentivize peer review.
Yeah, so this is, these are things we're discussing now as actually as part of the CellPress 50th anniversary, how we can continue to support our community of reviewers, and this webinar is part of that. There are certificates that you can get from Elsevier that will, that you'll have to indicate that you were a peer reviewer for the journal. It's, as far as paying peer reviewers, there are thoughts that it could create a conflict of interest situation where people would be signing to review papers that they're perhaps not fully invested in or qualified for in order to get the money. And that would not be ideal. It would also add to the overall cost of publication, which of course we don't want to do. And so that's not necessarily a sustainable way to ensure that the system is working going forward. We're open to considering all practical and appropriate ways of rewarding reviewers, and we're trying to think deeply about those things right now. And from my side, I think that contributing to the scientific community and ensuring that your colleagues are having constructive experiences, that's value. And that will ensure that they will also have a similar mindset when it's their turn to review your paper. So it's sort of a community-minded process.
And I would just add that from an institution, one of the things that we said at the beginning was really we viewed the review as a piece of scholarship. And I think that is important to see that people are contributing to that scholarship and that their opinions matter. And so how we consider, faculty applications and promotion process and all those other things, I think it really is a phenomenal thing to be doing and contributing to. And we really value, respect, and recognize it when we look at other scientists too. And certainly appreciate it for myself.
Yeah, same here. If I am providing a high quality review, I would like, reciprocal interaction. And I think thinking about paying reviewers will, from my, again, point of view, will taint that sort of, as you said, reciprocal community nature of the process. So it is a really challenging point, but I think, a lot of considerations, maintaining the confidentiality nature of the process. And I think, creative ways obviously will come, but yeah.
Ruthie, the other major question theme that came up, some of which we've answered and some of which we haven't, is thinking about language differences. And I think often English tends to be the primary language for which publishing and reviewing is occurring in, but that can create some challenges as well. We've talked a little bit about how AI should not be used to write a review. But at least in my opinion, spell check tools or something that can help, the grammar is an appropriate use of various online tools as well. Do you want to comment a little bit on navigating language and communication in peer review?
Yeah, so it can be a challenge. The most successful process that I've seen work, this is my personal experience, which is if you have a colleague who has excellent English skills, having their feedback. If it's a peer review, you can't ask someone to do it, but perhaps if you have someone in your lab who works for you, who might have participated in the review, that can be helpful. You can reach out to your editor and you can express your concerns directly to the editor. You could probably ask them to help you with grammar if there are any grammar mistakes. So as an editor, we wouldn't change the review, but we could make changes that you could support, if that makes sense. We wouldn't do it independently because that's your work, not our work. So those would be the avenues I would suggest for being a review. For author, there are some resources for authors to help them with language that are available online. So.
And then maybe one final question about tone. I think we've talked about how important it is to be constructive and appropriate throughout. Are there times where an editor may help provide feedback if someone's tone isn't necessarily matching the most constructive version?
There are times when an editor might approach a reviewer and ask them to change some parts of a review. We wouldn't want to do it ourselves because I think it's not transparent. But there might be times when we would reach out to the reviewer and ask them to make some changes. Yeah, it's not very common, but it could happen. Yeah. And, is one thing I will also say, this is just candidly, as editors, we read a lot of reviews and we tend to get kind of thick skins to some of the some comments, just because we sometimes language differences can make things seem less constructive than they're intended, if that makes sense. So as an author, I would also just bear in mind when you're reading this that tone can be difficult to understand sometimes just from the wording itself. So yeah.
And maybe we could then finish with a few final comments and really to thank everybody for showing up today, because even showing up indicates that how much people value and care about this peer review. It shouldn't be something that's mysterious. It should be transparent. And I think for me, again, I've really valued watching these processes. I really find them quite deliberate and constructive from both the author side, the reviewer side, the editor side. We're all really aspiring to make science as good as we can. And ultimately, we're people behind this, and I think Ruthie being here, for example, is a great indication of how much the professional editors that I know really care about this and doing it deliberately. And both Yadira and myself as reviewers really want to make sure we're doing the best. And then when I submit a paper, I love seeing this, and so I really hope everybody here today, has an opportunity to serve on both sides of this, and really takes both of those processes seriously and constructively as they navigate it.
Yeah, and I think to me the one important point to highlight is that this is a process that you'll continue learning how to do it, and it never stops, right? And it doesn't matter how long it's been since you started your science career. It takes a long time, and I myself am still learning how to do this properly, and I think that's the beauty of it. We continue learning, and just be open-minded and enjoy.
Yeah, and again, I would like to thank Iain and Yadira. I am so grateful for your participation and your sharing your experience. It's wonderful.